Between the years 1850 and 1873, the face of Paris changed forever, and very dramatically and controversially. Everything was done under the watchful eye of Napoleon III, with the brains of Baron Haussmann. What happened? What was the legacy of it? And where can you find the work of Haussmann today? That is what we'll be taking a very deep dive into. My name is Oliver G. This is the Eiffel Tower. You're listening to the AB season, and H is for Haussmann, Baron Haussmann. Here's some music from Pres Maxson. That was the music of Pres Maxson. I'll talk about that in a little second, but first I want to introduce today's guest. His name is Boris Petrovich. How are you?
I'm very well, Oliver. Thanks for having me.
How was my pronunciation?
Excellent, on point.
I want to do this straight from the beginning. Paris in Person is your company.
That's right.
Haussmannian Paris is the tour.
Yes.
So before we say anything, if people want to get deeper into this, book a tour with Boris, the most intelligent tour guide in Paris. I've said it before, I'll say it again.
Thank you.
So Haussmannian Paris, check him out, and his website is
parisinperson.com.
Now, are you ready to nerd out about Haussmann with me?
More than ready.
Okay, Now there's a concern I have, is that when we started talking, you said you've got at least 4 hours to say. This is a 30 to 40 minute podcast.
Yep, so you'll have to clip me. Yeah.
We're going to have to clip you. But first I want to talk about that music that we just heard, okay? So you have to allow me to talk for a second.
Go ahead.
Pres Maxson, he said, to honor Haussmann, I turned to French indie musician Fred Perriot and his tune Cette ville a changé, as in this town has changed. You see where he's going here?
I see.
He says, and like Haussmann, I deconstructed and reimagined the tune in the same way that he did with the city. I bulldozed the first verse, paved over the chorus vocal with a harpsichord, because H is for harpsichord as well, and then I put down electric piano solo that some might say wiped the landscape of the original tune clean beyond recognition. And lastly, I changed the key from E to G, so the first two chords of each phrase were G and E minor, a nod to his initials, Georges Eugène.
I am impressed.
And the music was great too. Thanks, Pres Maxson, our maestro of music. And he leads us really nicely into our 5 sort of mini topics today, which we've gone over before. The first is, who was Baron Haussmann?
Yeah. Haussmann or Haussmann
How do you, like the French pronounce it differently?
Haussmann, yeah. It's funny because where I come from, Haussmann is something connected to Haussmannian Empire, like the Ottoman Empire. So this is something that I was thinking about first. But yeah, Haussmann was an architect and an urban planner who was engaged by Napoleon III with the mission to completely rebuild the city of Paris, basically wipe it down and destroy between 60 and 70% of it, and then build everything anew.
And we're going to talk, in fact, I'll give you the look ahead. We're going to talk about who he was, what he did, why he went, as in why it finished, where you can find his work in Paris, and what is his legacy. I've got some facts here. I've researched too, Boris, which I think surprised you.
Not that much, but yes.
Boris, you've been on this show a bunch now. I was thinking about this. Do you remember the first thing we did?
I think it was like 20 questions on like 20 things to recommend in Paris.
Yeah, years and years ago, right?
Yeah, it was in your old studio, yeah.
And then you were on the show as recently as last week talking about Hector Guimard.
That's true, yeah.
And now here we are in my apartment talking about Haussmann.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll be back for the letter I as well.
I hope so.
I've got some facts, I've got some quotes too, but just for people playing at home, Haussmann, let's call him Haussmann from now on.
Yeah, Haussmann, okay. That's the English pronunciation, yeah.
Born in 1809, died in 1891, and critics forced his resignation for extravagance, but his vision of the city still dominates central Paris. Is that fair?
That's very fair, because the city of Paris did not change since Haussmann left his post. So the way he designed it, the way he wanted it to be, it still pretty much is.
And do you think it's fair to say that, I mean, when you say that he redesigned everything, like he added so many things that people know and love about Paris, huge monuments, things like train stations, parks, the arrondissements as we know it. He really Like, you know what I think is weird is like when people talk about that redesign of Paris, they call it the Haussmannian redesign. Why don't they call it the Napoleon III redesign or whatever?
Well, because it was really Haussmannian vision. It was since he was the architect, Napoleon gave the idea. Napoleon was the impetus behind it. He was basically the state that stood behind the work of Haussmann, but it was his aesthetics and it was his inspiration. So he was the more important part. He's the artistic part of this duo, right? You always have the business part and you have the artistic part. He was the creative force behind everything.
But when, like, I think a lot of people, when they hear Haussmann, people who've heard of him, they'll think of those sort of uniform Paris buildings, apartment residences.
Oh, yeah, rightfully so, yeah.
But was that him that sat down with a pen and sketched it, or did he talk to all these designers and go, this is what I'm thinking, go for it?
He basically made the plan of the city, and he made very, very detailed plans of how every house and every building should look like. And then he gave those plans basically borders to many different architects and designers, and they were to act within that framework. So he is the one who created the framework. He created the polygon for all the other artists and designers and architects to work with.
Okay, and we're getting dangerously close here to starting to talk about what he did. I just want to add quickly, I didn't read his memoirs, but I've read about his memoirs.
Close enough.
He sounded like a kind of funny guy. He said that when he'd sort of succeeded, the Napoleon III said to him, what do you want as a title? Like, you can have an honorary title. And he said that he wanted to be the aqueduc. As in, he'd done the water systems. Yeah, he wanted to be a duke, but they didn't go for it, so he became a baron, although it never was official. He remained legally Monsieur Haussmann, but everyone calls him Baron Haussmann.
Yeah, nowadays he's known as Baron, yeah.
Right. So. And then the other thing I thought was kind of cool, the Emperor's Minister of the Interior, Victor de Persigny, described interviewing him for the post, like when they were trying to get him in there. And they said, this is what Victor said, it was Haussmann who impressed me the most. It was a strange thing, but it was less his talents and remarkable intelligence that appealed to me, but the defects in his character. I had in front of me one of the most extraordinary men of our time, big, strong, vigorous, energetic, and at the same time clever and devious with a spirit full of resources. What does that say to you, Boris?
Well, it's very interesting for me because, you talk of him as this very funny, interesting, layered person, but when you look at his work and when you look at the city he left behind, it's incredibly strict, rhythmical, disciplined, it's rigorous, right? What I think about when I think about Haussmann is rigor and repetition and uniformity. Like, I would say uniformity is the key. And this is really why people who like Paris, who think that Paris is the most beautiful city in the world, they think it because of Haussmann, because of his very, very strict, disciplined, rigorous vision. So to me, that's an interesting situation where you say that he's a funny character, but his work is so incredibly strict. Now, I would like to compare it with the situation we have with French classicism in literature, that nowadays we think of it as this extremely rigorous literary style that is super disciplined, that is very, very prohibitively strict. But back in the day, people who wrote in that style, they were seen as revolutionaries. They were like crazy innovators. No one understood their vision because the dominant style was very, extravagant, exuberant, with full of literary flourishes. So this idea of simplicity, of less is more, was seen as incredibly creative and innovative and, revolutionary. And you can see Haussmann in those terms as well, like someone who decided to stand behind his vision that was not necessarily understood, that was highly controversial, but that proved to be incredibly successful.
Let's talk about this. I think this controversy, we see it time and time again in the history of Paris, even modern Paris. We've seen it with the Eiffel Tower, we've seen it with Les Halles, every time Les Halles gets rebuilt, including recently. And
people complain. Yeah.
Everything. People hate it. Montparnasse Tower.
Yeah. Centre Pompidou, the great library, François Mitterrand. Like, every time something new is made in Paris, people hate it with the passion to this day.
And I was thinking about that today, and I was wondering, is it that, especially you say that everyone who knows and loves this Paris, they're loving what people hated.
Yep.
Do you think the people are wrong? Or do you think that the people are just so ahead of their time who design it? What's going on here?
I can honestly see both sides, and I can understand both sides. Because if you think about controversy of Haussmann's work, you think about the fact that he's destroyed a lot of incredibly valuable buildings, a lot of churches from the 12th and the 13th and the 14th century, a lot of hôtels particuliers, private villas. markets, so he ripped through the medieval core of the city so as to create space for boulevards and avenues. So this is obviously, a great damage was done. And you can understand that people who are into medieval architecture, or who are simply into history, preservation of history, they would be incredibly sorry, right, desolate, that old city of Paris disappeared. However, you can also say that the city of Paris was not terribly sanitary, hygienic, like it was pretty much the opposite of that. You can use the term that David Harvey used, creative destruction, which I think explains Haussmann's vision the best. So you have to destroy the old to make space for new. And every time that happens, it's going to be controversial because, you and I are both lovers of history. We would be desolate that, a beautiful old building is destroyed. We all remember how much we suffered when the roof top of Notre Dame was burning. When we thought that the whole thing might not survive. So, it's heartbreaking. But you imagine that on a city level, right? On the level of the entire city, just intentionally destroying.
Have we ever talked about Notre Dame together on this podcast?
I think we mentioned it,
Where were you?
In passing.
Where were you when
I was at my place, but I gave a tour of Notre Dame as it was burning, a couple of hours before the fire. So I was really inside Notre Dame on that day. Yeah,
that could be another episode.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah.
I think there's two things I want to point out for people's perspective here. Middle of the 19th century, Paris was viewed as overcrowded, dark, unhealthy. 1845, the French social reformer Victor Considerant said that Paris is an immense workshop of putrefaction where misery, pestilence, and sickness work in concert, where sunlight and air rarely penetrate. It doesn't sound very, appealing.
Appealing? No, not really, no. If you add, constant cholera and tuberculosis breakouts and pandemics, it doesn't sound appealing at all. And it's this very curious situation where you have an incredibly wealthy city. France is a colonial empire at the time, close to peak of its colonial power and prowess, and you have so much money pouring into the city, you have so many people pouring into the city, but the city itself is essentially medieval. If it comes to, urban planning, it hasn't really changed from the 13th century onwards. And so this is not a sustainable situation. Something needs to happen, When we think about Haussmannian reconstruction, we're mostly thinking about streets, avenues and boulevards, and parks, things to that nature. But it's also, building sewage systems. It's also building, introducing running water into houses or things like that. It's really modernizing the city, right? What I think we don't really necessarily think about enough or talk about enough is the industrial aspect of the Haussmannian project. That's something that was only made possible through the Industrial Revolution and through colonial process, those two things. So to me, it's something that needed to happen. Now, could have it happened otherwise? That's highly debatable. Yeah,
I think I can most understand how annoyed, because it was 17 years, right?
Yeah,
I can understand how irritating that must have been for anyone that lived anywhere near it. Yep. 17 years of, how annoying it is when someone's renovating the building next to you.
I very much know.
For 6 weeks,
Yeah.
I can get it. And I got one more. I'm not going to do quotes the whole time, but I wanted to research a few. Baudelaire, are you a fan?
Oh, so. I'm familiar. Not a fan, but yeah.
Do you know his poem, The Swan?
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
I've translated it from French to English, but it's very relevant. It goes, there used to be a poultry market here, and one cold morning I saw a swan that had broken out of its cage, webbed feet clumsy on the cobblestones, white feathers dragging through uneven ruts, and obstinately pecking at the drains. Paris changes, but in sadness like mine nothing stirs. New buildings, old neighborhoods turn to allegory, and memories weigh more than stone.
Well, when we talk about Baudelaire, it's really his social engagement in politics that we should talk about. He was very critical of the Haussmannian intervention. He loaded everything that happened, disappearance of old Paris, medieval. It is unsanitary old Paris, but it's also mystical, quaint, cute. It's the most favorite part of today's Paris are, cachets where you can still see the old pre-Haussmannian Paris, right? So this is something we feel is really quaint and cute and amazing, parts of Quartier Latin, parts of Marais, parts of Montmartre. So Baudelaire was very much against it, but more importantly, he was against the entire bourgeois politics, right? He was against the industrial capitalism as such, huge social inequalities that followed the Haussmannian intervention, and the fact that this new city was basically built for the wealthy people, right? It was built for the bourgeois. It wasn't built for the poor. It didn't really think about necessities of the poor, right? So it was built for capital. It's the expression of capital. And this is something that makes it so interesting today, right? Because we still live in pretty much the same world. So this is the great vision, of both Haussmann and Napoleon III and the Pereire brothers, and that entire socioeconomic context.
You can't just drop the brothers without explaining.
Yeah, okay, we need to. So they are the main financiers behind the Haussmannian intervention. Those are the guys who created the economic background. They basically made the whole thing possible through their innovative and ingenious vision of banking, right? So there was this great conflict between the Pereires and the Rothschilds, the great competition in banking, where Rothschilds were very conservative. They thought that banking was just keeping other people's money, where Pereires thought that you should invest in the market, banks should be active players in the field of economy. They should make buildings, bridges, infrastructure. So they were very creative, very brave. They ended up in bankruptcy because they overplayed. But their vision, they got too creative, as most financiers do. But we live in their vision of their world, right? They made the whole thing possible. And quaintly, there's a street in Paris that's called Boulevard Pereire. It's a boulevard, right? It's very Haussmannian. And it's in the 17th district. But so the whole thing is that when we're talking about Haussmannian reconstruction, there's a very strong socioeconomic and political and ideological background of the whole thing. And this is what Baudelaire was mostly critical of. If you're talking about Baudelaire, he was very sorry that old Paris was disappearing. And with buildings, as he said in the poem, it's memories, it's lifestyle. It's basically how you identify with your geography, So, when you change neighborhoods, how you have to retrace your steps, like you have a new post office, you have a new grocery store, you kind of have to get around, the new neighborhood. And imagine what that was like back in the day when 60 to 70% of the city was literally annihilated, right? So razed to the ground and then built anew. Now, this is incredible in its ambition. It's incredible, how courageous they were, and it's also incredible how much corruption followed this thing, like with displacing people from their apartments, from their houses. Not everyone wanted to sell their place to be torn down, so they were removed by force. You can imagine, how many people got in and how much money was swindled or made or lost. And it's one of the greatest and first possibly examples of collusions of state and private initiative, private capital, right? So you could watch it as this incredible work of corruption, right? As much as something that, has a lasting vision and an aesthetically impressive vision, right? So even if you disagree, let's say that I personally don't necessarily like Haussmannian aesthetics because I find it a bit too anal and sterile and repetitive, but I cannot say that it's not impressive, right? I cannot say that it's not overwhelmingly imposing. So it's a very much a lasting vision.
For people driving in the Australian outback right now thinking, what is a typical Haussmannian? When they're thinking, whoa, Boris, I can't even imagine a typical Haussmannian residential building. How do you know when you're looking at one?
Okay, so if you're in Paris, so you can very clearly tell a difference between a pre-Haussmannian and a post-Haussmannian building. First of all, pre-Haussmannian building in most cases will have uneven floor heights. So you will see that windows are of different sizes, right? The further you go upwards, the smaller ceilings go. So you have lower and lower ceilings the further you go. Haussmann introduced this idea, that had to do with the French Revolution, with this democratic, republican, egalitarian project that all of the floors should be equal, right? So you have the first to sixth floor, they're all equal. Second of all, there's a limited number of floors. It's mostly 6 plus 1, so you have 6 stories. And then you have the chambre de bonne, it's like the 7th story, which is basically like an attic.
We've all lived in one.
Exactly. Some of us still do.
I think I still do as well.
Yeah, to a certain extent. Yeah. So then there is this very important concept, and this is something I wanted us to talk about, that is very pertinent and very relevant today, that Haussmann really had this vision of living in a city, right? A fully urbanized unit where one building is basically a place of commerce, a place of business, and a residence, right? So he had this idea that you should ideally live all of your life and have all of the necessities in one building.
In the same building?
In the same
Okay,
building,
right.
right? So this is interesting to you people from the New World, that you have to drive everywhere, like for hours on end, right? Because you have the downtowns and you have the suburbs. Haussmann wanted the opposite of that. He wanted basically to have a building where on the ground floor you would have a commerce, right? That's where you go and consume. Then on the first and sometimes second floor, you would have businesses, you would have offices. So this is where you go to work. And then, on the second and third floor and all the other floors, you would have residences, right? So ideally, in theory, you would have all of your life within one building. You would not have to move, right? And this is very popular nowadays. Since we're trying to fight pollution and global warming and all these things, we're trying to cut down on usage of transportation in cities.
15-minute cities.
Exactly, 15-minute cities, right? Walkable cities. And the thing that is really interesting about Haussmannian Paris is that it was truly made as a pedestrian city, right? Now, it had this ambitious vision of very wide streets, very wide boulevards and avenues. So the width of these streets is what is really amazing. But we always need to remember that this was made as a pedestrian city, right? So these streets become truly impressive if you think about people walking, not taking a car. Because, cars came with the necessity to widen everything, to have wider and wider streets. So in America, for example, we have like 12-lane highways, But no, these
Some people listening are in those highways right now. Isn't that
as
crazy?
we speak, yeah.
No, listening to this show now, they're like, I'm in one.
How dare you?
But when you're talking about him redoing what years are we talking about here?
So we're talking between 1853 to 1870.
And is the cars, where do they come into the picture?
Late 19th century, nowhere near there.
So he was making these big avenues for horse and carriages and pedestrians.
Mostly pedestrians, then horses and carriages, and then only later, like decades later, we would have cars.
Yeah. And when we're you're talking about like the Champs-Élysées and stuff like that, these kind of massive big avenues.
Yeah.
Wow, that's crazy to
Well,
think
Champs-Élysées is like the widest one, very intentionally so. And I think we can do an entire episode because it's super interesting, the relation between Napoleon I and Napoleon III and his vision and how that street avenue changed around their ambitions. But yeah, we need to think about these wide streets being wide for pedestrians. Now, there are a couple of other reasons why they're wide. One of them is hygiene, something we started talking about, that Paris was, as you say, a concert of putrefaction of something like that, one of the quotes went. So they wanted very wide streets so that they would allow a lot of wind and air to take care of all the airborne diseases, right? This was really important. Then they wanted sort of security against fires. If you have a very wide street, the fire is not going to be able to jump from one part to the other. And, of course, they're visually impressive. Now, the true reason, something that we were talking about before, and you said that Haussmann denied himself, but I personally don't believe him, that he made these wide streets so that he would make protests more difficult. Right?
Yeah, so the conversation we had was we were talking about uprisings and fights and military
protests,
everything. People using the streets because in the old days, when it was narrow streets, it was easy to
block,
to block them off, right? And I had read that he said, no, I hadn't thought anything about that. I was just building it for the good of the people. You said nonsense.
Exactly. Yeah, I say nonsense. Because the whole thing, if we're looking at the socioeconomic aspect of the middle of the 19th century, second half of the 19th century, a lot of protests, people fighting for their rights. They're fighting for all the things today we take for granted, like weekends, 8-hour working days, medical security, social security, all these things. None of them existed. So people were protesting, people were fighting in the streets, they were fighting with the police, they were fighting with the army. And Haussmann made these really wide streets so that people could introduce army machines and vehicles, basically cannons, into the streets, and so they can fire at the protesters, right? So then Parisians favored, streets that had blocks, like that were paved with blocks, so they could take those blocks and hurl them at the police.
You mean like big cobblestones, essentially?
Cobblestones, yeah. So, and every time, people pave, the street over the cobblestone with the bitumen or with asphalt, Parisians are unhappy because that makes all the stones unavailable and they cannot protest, in full capacity. So there's this whole idea that, you're making a bourgeois city, right? You're making it beautiful, wide, but there's this background, right? You're making it, again, for the bourgeois and pretty much against the workers. So you're making it more difficult for the workers to fight, for their rights.
I think I'm coming back to something you said, that a lot of people who love Paris and the idea, the vision of Paris, they're thinking of these Haussmannian buildings. I feel like a lot of people who love Paris also love Montmartre and Marais and Latin Quarter because of the higgledy-piggledy mess of it as well.
Yep.
I'm sure I've been confused in the past about what's Haussmannian and what's not, but it sounds, the way that you describe it, it sounds very easy.
Yep.
Big, even, all the buildings are the same as the ones next door, more or less.
Yeah. So the way to recognize a Haussmannian street is very easy. You see all of the buildings are capped, like they're of the same height. And they're very similar styles. Like, as we said, Haussmann gave a set of instructions on how you can make a building, and then many different architects made their buildings within those instructions, right? So you can see buildings that are capped to be the same size and have slightly different, like balconies or ornamentations, but it's mostly very, very unified.
So we'll get into point 4 here, where you can find his work in Paris, but essentially like in the Marais and Montmartre, there's nothing Haussmannian.
There's something like things here and there. There would be like an odd building, an old couple of buildings, but yeah, not a lot. Like,
and is that because there was too many old medieval buildings that he didn't want to knock down that were in the way, kind of thing?
No.
Yeah, interesting.
So some of these, Montmartre is a bit different than Marais because Montmartre was only included in the city of Paris during the Haussmannian reconstruction. It wasn't a part of Paris.
Because there were 12 arrondissements before, and he made it to 20?
Yeah, he made it to 20. So it's a bit different than Marais. But yeah, the thing is that you can see a Haussmannian building and it has this very heavy, imposing, character to it. But it only comes to its full right, I would say, when you see a whole street, right? Because to me, Haussmann was more a urban planner than an architect, right? And you can really see his vision only, you can truly understand it when you're looking at the whole building, how it connects to the whole of the street. He also presented this idea that the street should begin and end with the prominent monument, which again takes us back to the pedestrian nature of Paris, is that as you're walking around the city, right, you want to be able to orient between prominent monuments. So let's say that Boulevard de Sébastopol begins with famously the ugliest fountain in the city, the Fontaine Saint-Michel, and ends with the...
Why is that famously the ugliest?
It's a very...
You mean the one in the Latin Quarter?
Yeah, that's the one, yeah. Because of the French aesthetics, because it's polychrome, it has more than one colors. People here hate anything that has more than one colors. Ideally, it would be 0 colors, right? That would be perfection.
We're talking about the same fountain, the one in the Latin Quarter with the Archangel.
Yeah, that's the one, yeah. And they claim that, the statue is really poorly made. It's very wooden and stiff.
I really like that statue. What does that say about me?
I'll let you answer.
Oh, no.
I'll let you answer that. But, yeah. So, yeah, that street begins with that fountain, let's say controversial fountain. It ends with Eastern train station Gare de l'Est. If you're talking about, let's say, Avenue de l'Opéra, which is like the most Haussmannian street in the city, I would argue, it begins with the Louvre Museum. It ends with the Opera House, the Opéra Garnier.
Right.
You're looking at Avenue des Champs-Élysées. It begins with the obelisk at Place de la Concorde. It ends, with the Triumphal Arch. So there is this idea of connection, and there is also this idea that's quite interesting that thanks to Haussmannian work, we have this new phenomenon of a flaneur. Now, this is something I think you mentioned many times in many different episodes. Flaneur.
I should have done F is for flaneur. Why did I do floods? That was Paris. What about this
next
flaneur?
time?
I thought flaneur came from earlier, from like Pont Neuf 400 years ago.
Yeah, but it really came into its own with the boulevards, right? And it came into its own with all of the books. No, sorry, not the books, but boutiques and windows, right? So the thing with Haussmannian vision was that it was very commercial. It was, industrial capitalism, and it was very heavily centered around commerce. So you're looking at the Opera District, you see that all those buildings were made with the intent of having boutiques in the ground floor. So the idea of a flaneur is that you just kind of get lost in the city, you roam around, because you're a bourgeois and you have money, you don't have to work. So you can just kind of idly roam the streets.
And buy things.
Yeah, exactly. Get lost, browse the windows, watch the people, judge the people, how they're dressed.
Sounds like what a lot of people like to do in Paris today, and that's a great way to lead us into the second half of this podcast. So here we are now with the second part of this. We're going to go, why did he go? Where can you find his work in Paris, and what is his legacy? We've kind of answered a few of them, but let's get through the first two really quickly. Why 17 years he's done it? Why did he move on?
I think he accomplished what he wanted to do. So that was it. Like, he basically built the skeleton of the city. He laid the groundwork, and then he had all these architects continue right in his footsteps. So he didn't really go anywhere in terms of, his legacy and in his vision. To this day, city of Paris did not change from what Haussmann envisioned, right? Because to this day, the city of Paris is surrounded by a peripheral highway, and everything that is inside this highway is considered the city of Paris, and everything outside is considered a suburb. So the way he designed it's still the same. So that would be my response to the first question.
I can add something to it, though. I got another quote.
Yeah.
He said he commented on his dismissal, so he was dismissed, right?
Yeah.
So it wasn't like he walked off and said, "I'm done." Right? But he said, in the eyes of the Parisians, who like routine in things but are changeable when it comes to people, I committed two great wrongs. Over the course of 17 years, I disturbed their daily habits by turning Paris upside down. That's true enough. And they had to look at the same face of the prefect in the Hotel de Ville, that's himself. These were two unforgivable complaints. I get it.
Yeah. French people, Parisian people, they're creatures of habit. Like, that's still the case, right? That didn't change for the last, 800 years.
Right. Since the Philippe Auguste Wall. Where can you find his work? We touched on this.
Yeah.
If you had to recommend a street where people could absolutely be smacked over the head with Haussmannian buildings left and right, where should they be walking?
I would say Avenue de l'Opéra. Like, the Opera District is the most Haussmannian part of the city, but if you really want to, be smacked in the mouth, you go to Barreau, to Boulevard Haussmann, Boulevard Haussmann, obviously.
Yeah, and you've agreed to go doing a live walk. How many live walks have we done now?
4, I think.
4?
Yeah, Rue Claire, Parc Monceau. I think we done one on Art Nouveau. That was a pretty good one.
Yeah.
3. I think there was another one. Yeah, at least 3.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so we're going to do our 4th. We'll go down those streets then?
Let's go, yeah.
Okay, perfect. More on that to follow. Let's talk about then his legacy. This is something we can focus on a little bit. I know personally that his ideas were copy-pasted in other cities around the world, including Chicago, Washington, Stockholm.
I would say Washington is a great example because that was built by a French urban planner too. And it had this general idea of being the new center of the world, being new Rome, much like the city of Paris. You can say that St. Petersburg was pretty much a copy of Paris, arguably more beautiful, but, still. You can say that even cities like Brasilia and Brazil, that was supposed to be like the new administrative, center of Brazil. It was built in communist aesthetics, but spirit of it is really Haussmannian because it's all incredibly arranged, it's all pre-planned. It's this idea that you design a city, right? To me, when I'm talking about Haussmannian Paris, it's a designed city. It's not a city that organically grew and developed, and assumed its shape over time, like let's say Prague or Venice, or some of those. City of Paris was truly designed, and then it happened, So Brasilia, the same thing. And even though aesthetics are quite different, it's brutalist, it's modernist, so it's modernist, but the idea, the driving force behind it, to me, is the same, right? It's Haussmannian. Canberra, right, from what I understand, is also quite Haussmannian in this regard, the capital of Australia.
I guess so, yeah. It was designed, it wasn't built based on the geography as much as it was based on urban planning. Shout out to all our Canberra listeners.
The Cambrians?
When you I don't know. I should know. I'm Australian. When you go, Boris, to other cities, like if you find yourself in, I think Brussels as well was one on the list. When you go to these cities, are you able to switch off as a tourist, or are you like, Haussmannian redesign influence here? Like, do you just get into your tour guide?
Nah, I get in my tour guiding mode. It's like I'm a massive nerd, so it's all about art history, and I do these cross references. I recognize traces and influences. So yeah. Honestly, to me, I like cities that are a bit more chaotic. I like cities that are more like Istanbul, like Belgrade, to a certain extent, New York. So I would like to make a comparison, between New York and Paris, although it's completely incomparable, but exactly in this regard, right? So if you're looking at the city of New York, it's on a grid. And so every street is on a 90 degrees angle. So they're all incredibly precise and sharp. There's only one street, Broadway, that is slightly diagonal, and everything else is very, very orderly. But every building is its own world and its own universe. So buildings are completely incoherent, right? You would see a skyscraper that's 500 meters tall next to a building that's like 4 stories tall. However, in Paris, you have the opposite situation, right? So you have these organic streets, that are circular and diagonal, or if they're pre-Haussmannian, they just make no sense whatsoever. But the buildings are incredibly polished and orderly and structured and repetitive, right? So it's like you can have either, your streets being very anal and your buildings just exploding, or you can have it the other way around. You can have like an organic street design with buildings that are incredibly polished. And Paris and Haussmannian vision, it's obviously the latter.
On a side note, do you think that other cities in France have a similar thing to what Paris has with the Haussmannian redesign?
Some of them, yeah. Some of them do to a certain extent, or they have parts of the city that are more or less Haussmannian. But none of them to this extent, right?
And when we talk about the legacy of Haussmann in Paris, like we've talked about already now that a lot of people love that idea of Haussmannian uniformity, the beauty of Paris. How do you think the Parisians and the French people feel about it? Have they come to terms with something that a lot of them didn't like at the beginning?
No, I wouldn't say so. No, I think it's a very Parisian thing to dislike, like the world in general and your city in particular. So it's like this very strange mixture of being proud of being Parisian and absolutely hating it at the same time. People here have a propensity to complain. So I would say like they still complain about many things, and Haussmannian reconstruction is one of them. So especially if you're a bit left-leaning and you see this his aesthetics as oppressive, as bourgeois, as capitalistic, as again vehicle of great corruption, all these things. I mean, there are all these negative traits of his vision and his ideology and his work, but there are obviously many positive ones too. So to me, it's always what I really think about when I think about Haussmann, what I really think about is this great ambition and this fearlessness that he showed in basically destroying one of the greatest capitals of the world so that he could create, an even greater capital of the world. So if you think about his legacy, I would take an example of another great French architect, Corbusier, or Le Corbusier, who also had an idea of completely annihilating the city of Paris and building it in his own, brutalist vision. So he wanted to tear down all of the Haussmann's work and build, completely redesign Marais and then everything else. And you can find this, and you can put links to, his vision of Paris, and you can see that in ambition, in vision, he was basically a follower of Haussmann, right? So to me, when any time you have someone who has that big of an ambition that he wants to destroy an entire city, a world-famous city, right? Famous for its beauty, his arts, its culture, its cuisine, its everything. Yeah, to me, that's Haussmannian, right?
I think it's, and we can sort of wind things up now, but I think it's amazing, and I think this almost every week that I do this podcast, of how much is under the surface of this city, but yet in plain sight. How many deep stories, deep history, things that could have been, things that have been, that you either know and appreciate, or don't know at all but still appreciate this city. And I think that's one of the magical things here.
Oh, yeah, I would agree, yeah.
And on that note, we'll wind things up, and I'll say, Boris, thanks so much. Haussmannian Paris in person.
Yep.
That will be linked below. People can meet you yourself. I know you got a bunch of guides, but I think they can specifically request you.
Is
that
yeah.
Okay, good. And thanks so much for being on the show.
Yeah, pleasure. Looking forward to being here again.
Boris, you're still here?
I'm still here.
I just wanted to do a shout out, an email. I'll show you the pictures while you're here. While I was still on the trace of Guimard, firstly I went to the Architecture Museum at Trocadero. Have you been there?
Yeah. Cité de l'Architecture, yeah.
Terrible name, I think. They don't even call it anything.
Great museum, but terrible branding, yeah.
One of the best museums in Paris. So I want to give a shout out to them. And knowing that I was doing Guimard and Haussmann back to back, I wanted to snoop around and see what they had. And they had a few things from the Castel Béranger. But also they had a cool map, like a 3D map of Paris before and after Haussmann.
Okay.
Have you seen this?
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah.
So I thought that was quite
maps,
worth it.
Yeah.
And I think if you're even remotely into architecture, check out that museum. But speaking of Guimard, I got an email I'll read while you're still here from Tom and Paula Munger. And they say, in November of 2017, we had a 2-day layover in Paris, which by chance coincided with a rare opening to the public of a Guimard residence, the Hôtel Mézara. You know which one that is,
Yep.
right? Have you been inside?
I haven't been inside. I've been outside.
You know it's for sale.
Really? Oh. Are we able to afford it?
I have a feeling
Between the two
they
of
don't
us?
put the price up
Oh,
there,
okay.
you know. They continue. It was a cold, drizzly day, but that didn't stop a throng of fans. The exhibit was small but very interesting. It was too crowded for many photos, but check out what we've got here. And then he sent a picture of the interior.
Oh, they kept it as it is.
It is
Okay.
incredible
Wow,
inside.
look at this.
So the reason I showed that is, firstly, I think me and Boris wanted to see those pictures anyway. But second, if you're out there and you're enjoying these episodes, you got cool pictures, cool stories, send them in, because we like to see it and I like to share them. Have you got any favorite Guimard places in Paris?
I would have to be kind of boring with it and say it's the subway entrance, but behind the subway entrance is the synagogue in Rue Pavée. So to
yes.
me, that's such a beautiful, elegant...
Hang on, I asked you this on the podcast last week.
Yeah, I did.
Okay,
Yeah,
sorry, let me say it again. Okay. Last week on the show, you mentioned the synagogue. Mm-hmm. Have you been inside?
Yeah, many
That's
times.
on my list. How did you get in?
It was much easier back in the day. Now they've made it hard, and it's only available for worship. So you have to go there, Yeah.
Okay. So, maybe for next season
Or if you
something.
beg them, you just go and say, please. Sometimes they do let you in. You make a little donation, they let you in. Yeah.
Thanks for the tip, Boris. And thanks again for being on the show.
Yeah, my pleasure.